Every morning at 6:47 a.m., Robert woke up with the same tightness in his chest. It wasn't physical pain. It was something deeper. It was the fear that at some point the numbers in his bank account would reach zero before his heart stopped beating. He would stare at the bedroom ceiling, mentally calculating, how much time do I have left? How long will the money last? The ceiling had a small water stain in the corner, a reminder of the roof repair he'd postponed 3 times because it cost $400. $400 that could mean the difference between eating well for a month or rationing meals. At least, that's what his mind told him every time he looked up at that brown spot. At 68 years old, Robert discovered that retirement wasn't the paradise he had imagined. It was a golden prison, where the bars were made of spreadsheets and fear was his only constant companion. If you've ever felt this fear, if you've ever woken up in the middle of the night thinking, will it be enough, type just one word in the comments: fear. I want to know I'm not talking to myself here. Robert lived in a 2-bedroom house in Ohio. Nothing extravagant, nothing luxurious, just enough. Or at least that's what he repeated to himself every morning while drinking his black coffee, because sugar cost money, and money was something he couldn't waste. The house had been their dream home once. He and Margaret had bought it 35 years ago, when David was just 7 years old. Back then, the mortgage payments seemed manageable, even exciting. They were building something together, a future, a legacy. Now, the house felt too big and too small at the same time. Too big because every room echoed with memories of a family that no longer existed. Too small because the walls seemed to close in on him with each passing day, trapping him with his thoughts and calculations. Robert's routine was pure mathematics. Wake up at 6:47 a.m., black coffee at 7:15 a.m., check bank accounts at 7:30 a.m., and then the rest of the day was a long wait until he could repeat everything the next day. But between those scheduled moments were the unscheduled ones that really defined his existence. The moments when he would stand in front of the refrigerator, calculating whether he could afford to replace the milk that had gone sour. The moments when he would hold a prescription at the pharmacy, wondering if he really needed those vitamins the doctor recommended. The moments when he would sit in his car in the grocery store parking lot, rewriting his shopping list for the 3rd time, removing items that weren't absolutely essential. Do you know what it's like when the silence of an empty house becomes deafening? Robert knew. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 3 years earlier, not by choice, but because cancer doesn't negotiate with anyone. And along with her went not only the laughter that echoed through the house, but also the sense of financial security they had built together. Margaret had been the optimist in their relationship. While Robert worried about every expense, she would remind him that money was meant to be lived with, not just saved. "We can't take it with us, Bobby," she would say, using the nickname only she was allowed to use, "but we can use it to make beautiful memories." Those words haunted him now, not because they were wrong, but because they were so painfully right. Robert had worked 42 years as an accountant at a mid-sized company. He wasn't rich, but he wasn't poor either. He had a modest retirement, some savings, and the house was paid off. On paper, he was fine, but paper can't calm a heart that beats irregularly at 3 a.m. His career had been built on numbers, on predictability, on making sure everything added up correctly. For 4 decades, he had helped other people manage their finances, plan for their futures, make sense of their economic lives. The irony wasn't lost on him that now, in his own retirement, numbers had become his enemy rather than his friend. Because here's the truth. No one tells you about retirement. It's not just about having enough money. It's about being certain you'll have enough money, and certainty. Well, certainty was something Robert had lost the day Margaret closed her eyes for the last time. Her medical bills had consumed a good portion of their savings. Not everything, but enough for Robert to start seeing numbers where he once saw dreams. Where he once planned trips they never took, he now calculated how many years his savings would last if he spent exactly $2,147 per month. The number $2,147 had become sacred to him. It was the result of countless calculations, spreadsheets that covered his kitchen table like battle plans. Housing costs, utilities, food, insurance, medications, emergency fund, every category meticulously planned and ruthlessly minimized. But life, Robert was learning, doesn't respect budgets. What if inflation went up? What if he needed medical care? What if the roof finally gave way? What if his car broke down? What if? The what-ifs became Robert's only companions. They visited him during breakfast, had lunch with him, and put him to bed every night. They whispered to him while he watched television, reminding him that every hour of electricity cost money. They followed him to the mailbox, turning every envelope into a potential financial catastrophe. Have you ever lived like this? Have you ever felt that life became a giant spreadsheet where every penny is a soldier fighting against time? The worst part wasn't the fear itself. It was how the fear had changed him. Robert remembered being different once. He remembered laughing at David's jokes without calculating the cost of the long-distance phone call. He remembered buying Margaret flowers on random Tuesdays just because he loved her. He remembered feeling generous, spontaneous, alive. Now he felt like a ghost haunting his own life. It was on a Tuesday in October that everything changed. Robert was at the supermarket, as he always did on Tuesdays, because on Tuesdays there was a 10% discount for seniors. He was holding a can of tomato soup, looking at the price, $1.89. 6 months earlier, the same can cost $1.67. It might seem silly, but for Robert, those extra 22 cents represented something much bigger. They represented inflation eating his savings like termites eat wood, slowly, silently, but relentlessly. He stood there in aisle 7, holding that can of soup, and suddenly felt overwhelmed by the mathematics of survival. If soup went up 22 cents, what about bread? What about milk? What about his medications? What about everything? In his mind, he could see his carefully calculated budget crumbling like a house of cards. The $2,147 per month suddenly seemed woefully inadequate against the relentless march of rising prices. He put the can back on the shelf and left the supermarket empty-handed. The drive home was a blur of self-recrimination. How had he become this person? How had he become someone who couldn't afford a can of soup? How had he become someone who was afraid of 22 cents? That night, Robert did something he hadn't done in months. He called his son David, who lived in California. The phone rang 3 times before David answered, and in those 3 rings, Robert almost hung up. What would he say? How could he explain that he was calling because a can of soup had broken something inside him? "Hi, Dad. What a surprise. How are you?" David's voice was warm, genuinely happy to hear from him. It had been 2 months since their last conversation, and Robert suddenly realized how much he had missed that voice. Robert wanted to say, "I'm scared, son. I'm scared the money will run out. I'm scared of becoming a burden to you. I'm scared of dying poor and alone. I'm scared that I've wasted the last 3 years of my life being afraid instead of living." But what came out of his mouth was, "I'm fine, David. I just wanted to hear your voice." They talked for 17 minutes. Robert knew it was 17 minutes because he was watching the clock, calculating the cost of the long-distance call. But for those 17 minutes listening to David talk about his job, his wife Sarah, the kids, Robert felt something he hadn't felt in months: connection. After he hung up the phone, Robert sat in his armchair, the same armchair where Margaret used to knit. And for the first time in 3 years, he cried. He didn't cry for the loss of Margaret, though he missed her every day. He didn't cry for loneliness, though the house felt empty without her laughter. He cried because he realized he had become a prisoner of his own fears. He cried because he understood that in trying so hard to preserve his life, he had stopped living it. He cried because he knew Margaret would be heartbroken to see what he had become. It was in that moment of total vulnerability that something interesting happened. Robert remembered a book that Margaret used to read, a book about ancient philosophy that she kept on the nightstand. He had never paid attention, but that night, moved by a curiosity he hadn't felt in years, he went to the bedroom and picked up the book. Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. The book was worn, with Margaret's handwriting in the margins. She had underlined passages, made notes, engaged with the text in a way that Robert had never understood. Philosophy had always seemed impractical to him, irrelevant to the real world of numbers and budgets and practical concerns. Robert opened the book to a random page and read, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." In the margin, Margaret had written, "For Bobby, when the worry gets too much." He read the sentence again, and once more. "You have power over your mind, not outside events." For the first time in 3 years, Robert felt something different from fear. He felt curiosity. Had Margaret known this day would come? Had she known that he would need these words, this wisdom, this reminder that there was another way to think about life? In the following days, Robert began reading the book. Not because he believed that a Roman emperor from 2,000 years ago could solve his financial problems, but because he had nothing left to lose. And it was reading about Stoicism that Robert discovered something revolutionary. The difference between what he could control and what he couldn't control. Inflation, he couldn't control it. The stock market, he couldn't control it. How long he would live, he couldn't control it. The cost of medical care, he couldn't control it. Whether his roof would leak again, he couldn't control it, but his response to these things that he could control. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Today I escaped anxiety," or no, I discarded it because it was within me, in my own perceptions, not outside. Robert read that sentence 7 times before he fully understood it. The anxiety wasn't coming from his bank account. It wasn't coming from inflation or medical bills or roof repairs. It was coming from his thoughts about these things. It was coming from his perception that he was powerless, that he was at the mercy of forces beyond his control. But what if he wasn't powerless? What if he had more control than he realized? I want to ask a question to those of you watching. How many times a day do you worry about things that are completely out of your control? Think about it for a moment. Gas prices, politics, what others think of you, whether it will rain tomorrow. Comment below. What's the worry that consumes you most and that you know you can't control? Let's talk about it. Robert's transformation didn't happen overnight. It wasn't like in the movies, where the character has a sudden revelation and everything changes. It was more subtle, more human. It started with small things. In the first week after starting to read about Stoicism, Robert still woke up at 6:47 a.m. with the tightness in his chest. But now, instead of immediately calculating how much money he had, he asked himself, what can I control today? The answer was always the same: his choices. He could choose to drink black coffee not because sugar was expensive, but because he liked the pure taste of coffee. He could choose to go to the supermarket on Tuesdays, not just for the discount, but because he liked the routine, the familiar faces of other seniors doing their shopping. He could choose to check his bank accounts once a week instead of 3 times a day. He could choose to call David not because he needed something, but because he wanted to hear his son's voice. Small choices, small controls, small victories. The first time Robert went a full morning without checking his bank balance, he felt like he had climbed a mountain. It was such a small thing, but it represented something enormous, the possibility that he could live differently. In the second week, something interesting happened. Robert was reading about the Stoic concept of amor fati, love of fate, when he realized he had spent an entire hour without thinking about money. An entire hour. It might not seem like much, but for someone who spent 16 hours a day obsessed with numbers, an hour was an eternity. During that hour, he had been completely absorbed in Marcus Aurelius's words about accepting what life brings, about finding peace, not in controlling circumstances, but in controlling his response to circumstances. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Accept the things you cannot change, have courage to change the ones you can, and wisdom to distinguish between them." Robert realized he had spent 3 years trying to control the uncontrollable, trying to guarantee he would live to 90, that inflation wouldn't rise, that he would never get sick, that he would never need help. But what if he simply accepted that he couldn't control these things? What if, instead of spending energy trying to predict the future, he spent energy living the present? The idea was both terrifying and liberating. It was then that Robert made a decision that would change everything. He decided to stop living as if he were going to die tomorrow and start living as if he were going to live forever. No, he didn't spend all his savings. He didn't travel the world. He didn't buy a sports car. He did something much more radical. He started living without fear. The first test came the very next day. Robert was at the grocery store again, standing in front of the soup aisle. The same can of tomato soup that had triggered his breakdown was there, still $1.89. For a moment, the old Robert surfaced. The voice in his head started calculating, "That's $0.22 more than 6 months ago. If every item goes up proportionally, your grocery budget will increase by..." But then Robert remembered Marcus Aurelius. "You have power over your mind." He picked up the can of soup and put it in his cart. It was such a small act, but it felt revolutionary. Robert began buying the $1.89 tomato soup without calculating the impact on his retirement. He started calling David once a week, not to ask for help, but to hear about his son's life. Those 17-minute conversations became the highlight of his week. He started leaving the house without a specific destination, just to walk and observe the world. He noticed things he had forgotten existed, the way morning light filtered through the oak tree in his front yard, the sound of children playing in the distance, the smell of someone's barbecue on a Sunday afternoon. And you know what happened? His savings didn't disappear. His health didn't worsen. The world didn't end. In fact, for the first time in 3 years, Robert felt alive. He discovered that the fear of not having enough money had become more expensive than any expense he could have. Fear was costing his peace, his mental health, his ability to connect with the people he loved. Fear was costing him his life. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." Robert finally understood. It wasn't about having enough money to live without fear. It was about living without fear, regardless of how much money he had. The breakthrough came in week 3. Robert was reading a passage about the impermanence of all things when he had a startling realization. He had been so focused on making his money last that he had forgotten to make his life matter. 6 months after starting to read Meditations, Robert did something he hadn't done in 4 years. He smiled spontaneously. He was at the supermarket, in the soup section, when he saw an elderly couple arguing about the price of a can of soup. The woman said, "It's too expensive, Harold. Let's buy the generic brand." The man sighed, clearly frustrated. "But you like this brand, Helen. You've been buying it for 30 years. 30 years ago, we could afford it," she replied, her voice tight with the same fear Robert knew so well. Robert approached and said, "Excuse me, I couldn't help but overhear. May I suggest something?" The couple looked at him, surprised and a little wary. "Buy the soup you really want. The 30-cent difference won't change your lives, but the satisfaction of eating something you enjoy, that can change your day." Harold looked skeptical. "Easy for you to say. You don't know our situation." Robert smiled gently. "Actually, I do. I've been exactly where you are. I spent 3 years afraid of every penny, calculating every purchase, living in fear that the money would run out before I did." Helen's expression softened. And what changed? I realized that I was so busy trying to survive that I forgot to live. The woman smiled. You're right. Thank you. As Robert walked home, he realized he had just given the advice he himself needed to hear 3 years ago. It wasn't about the money. It was never about the money. It was about the freedom to live without being controlled by fear of what might happen. In the following months, Robert's life changed in ways he had never imagined. Not because he became rich, not because his problems disappeared, but because he changed his relationship with uncertainty. He still checked his bank accounts, but now he did it like someone checking the weather forecast, to be informed, not to torture himself. He still made budgets, but now he included a category he had never considered before: life. $50 per month for life. Sometimes it was a new book. Sometimes it was a meal at a restaurant Margaret liked. Sometimes it was a long-distance call to a friend he hadn't seen in years. Sometimes it was flowers for Margaret's grave. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. $50 that, on paper, could be wasted, but that in practice bought something priceless: the feeling of being alive. The first time Robert spent money from his life category, he bought a small potted plant for his kitchen windowsill. It cost $12.99, and the old Robert would have calculated how many meals that represented, but the new Robert saw it differently. It was $12.99 invested in hope, in the belief that tomorrow would come, and that when it did, he wanted something beautiful to look at. Robert discovered that Marcus Aurelius was right. The happiness of your life depends upon the quality of your thoughts. He began practicing what the Stoics called memento mori, remembering that life is finite. But instead of using this as a source of anxiety, he used it as a source of perspective. If I die tomorrow, he would ask himself, will I regret not buying that more expensive tomato soup? The answer was always no. Will I regret not calling David? The answer was always yes. Will I regret not telling the people I love that I love them? The answer was always yes. Will I regret not seeing a sunset because I was too busy calculating the cost of gasoline to drive to the lake? The answer was always yes. Robert realized he had spent 3 years saving money for a future that might never come, while wasting the only moment he truly possessed, the present. It was then that he made a decision his friends considered irresponsible. He decided to use part of his savings to visit David in California. The decision didn't come easily. Robert spent 2 weeks calculating and recalculating the cost: airfare, hotel, meals, transportation. It would cost nearly $800. $800 that could pay for groceries for 3 months. But then he remembered something Margaret used to say: money is just a tool, Bobby. The question isn't whether you can afford to spend it. The question is whether you can afford not to. When Robert told David he was coming to visit, there was silence on the other end of the line. Dad, is everything okay? Do you need something? The question broke Robert's heart a little. When had he become the kind of father who only called when he needed something? When had their relationship become so transactional? No, son. I just want to see you. Another silence then. Dad, that's wonderful. When? Next month. If that works for you. Of course it works. Sarah will be so excited. The kids have been asking about Grandpa. After he hung up, Robert felt something he hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. Not anxiety about the future, but genuine excitement about something good that was coming. That trip cost $800. $800 that, 3 years earlier, Robert would have considered an irresponsible waste. But when he saw the smile on David's face at the airport, when he hugged his grandchildren for the first time in 2 years, when he sat at the dinner table of a family he had helped create, Robert realized that those $800 were the best investment he had ever made. The visit lasted a week, and every day brought new revelations. He watched David coach his daughter's soccer team and saw the man his little boy had become. He helped his grandson with homework and remembered the joy of teaching. He cooked dinner with Sarah and felt useful in a way that had nothing to do with money. Because here's the truth no one tells you about money. It only has value when it's used to create life, not when it's saved to avoid death. During the trip, David asked, "Dad, you seem different, lighter. What changed?" Robert thought for a moment and said, "I stopped trying to control what I can't control. And what can you control? My choices, my thoughts, how I respond to what happens to me." David smiled. "That sounds very Zen," Robert laughed. "Actually, it's stoic. I learned it from a Roman emperor. A Roman emperor? Marcus Aurelius. Your mother had his book. I finally read it." David's expression grew thoughtful. "Mom always said you worried too much." She was right, about a lot of things. That night in the guest room of David's house, Robert opened his copy of Meditations and read a passage he had underlined. "Confine yourself to the present." 3 simple words that had changed his entire life. Confine yourself to the present. Not to the uncertain future, not to the unchangeable past, to the controllable present. Robert realized he had spent 3 years living in a future that existed only in his imagination, a future where money ran out, where he got sick, where he became a burden. But the present was a paid-off house, reasonable health, a son who loved him, grandchildren who were excited to see him, and $800 less in the bank, but infinitely richer in memories. The present was enough, more than enough. When Robert returned to Ohio, something had fundamentally changed. Not in his circumstances, he was still a 68-year-old retiree with limited savings, but in his perspective. He looked at his house, at his armchair, at the kitchen where he drank black coffee every morning, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't see a prison. He saw a home. He saw the place where he and Margaret had raised their son, where they had shared thousands of meals, where they had built a life together. He saw not what he had lost, but what he still had. Robert understood that the fear of money running out before life had caused his life to end before the money. He had been so worried about surviving that he had forgotten to live. But now, armed with Marcus Aurelius's wisdom and the clarity that comes from acceptance, Robert made a promise to himself. He would live each day as if he were rich in time, not poor in money. Because here's the final truth. None of us knows how much time we have. None of us knows if the money will last. None of us can control the future, but all of us can control how we live today. Robert began waking up at 6:47 a.m., not with fear, but with gratitude. Gratitude for another day. Gratitude for a heated home. Gratitude for black coffee he chose to drink, not was forced to drink. Gratitude for a son who loved him. Gratitude for memories of a wife who had taught him, even in death, how to live. He still made budgets, still saved, still planned for the future. But now he did it from a place of wisdom, not fear. Of control, not desperation. Of acceptance, not resistance. The change was visible to everyone who knew him. His neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, commented that he seemed lighter somehow. The cashier at the grocery store mentioned that he smiled more. Even his doctor noticed that his blood pressure had improved. "Whatever you're doing, Robert," Dr. Martinez said during his annual checkup, "keep doing it. You seem like a different person." Robert was a different person, not because his circumstances had changed, but because his relationship with his circumstances had changed. 6 months later, Robert received a call that would change everything again. It was David. "Dad, I have news. Sarah is pregnant. You're going to be a grandfather again." Robert smiled, a genuine, deep smile that came from a place he had forgotten existed. "What wonderful news, son." "Dad, I wanted to ask, would you like to be here when the baby is born? I know it's expensive to travel, but..." Robert interrupted. "David, I wouldn't miss it for the world." "Really? Are you sure? I mean, I know money is tight." "Son," Robert said, and his voice was firm but gentle, "there are some things more important than money. This is one of them." After he hung up the phone, Robert looked at his bank account. Yes, Another trip would cost money. Yes, it would affect his savings. But for the first time in years, Robert didn't calculate whether he could afford to go. Instead, he asked himself, can I afford not to go? The answer was obvious. He booked his flight that afternoon. Today, Robert is 71 years old. His savings are smaller than they were 3 years ago, but his life is infinitely richer. He still reads Marcus Aurelius every morning, still practices Stoic principles, still distinguishes between what he can and cannot control. But the greatest lesson Robert learned didn't come from an ancient philosophy book. It came from understanding that true financial security isn't having enough money to live without fear. It's having enough wisdom to live with purpose, regardless of fear. Robert discovered that the antidote to fear isn't certainty, it's acceptance. Acceptance that life is uncertain. Acceptance that the future is uncontrollable. Acceptance that the only moment we truly possess is this one. And in this moment, this present, controllable, precious moment, Robert chooses to live, not survive. Live. He chooses to buy the soup he wants, not just the soup he can afford. He chooses to call his son because he loves him, not because he needs something. He chooses to spend money on life because he understands that a life unlived is the most expensive waste of all. Because in the end, the question isn't, will the money last longer than life? The question is, will life be lived before time runs out? For Robert, the answer is finally yes. And every morning at 6:47 a.m., when he wakes up without that tightness in his chest, he remembers Marcus Aurelius's words. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own. But Robert has adapted those words for his own life. When I wake up in the morning, I tell myself, today I will face uncertainty, unexpected expenses, and things I cannot control. But I have seen the beauty of living with purpose, and the ugliness of living in fear, and I choose purpose. If Robert's story touched you in some way, if you saw yourself in it, if it changed something in your perspective about money, fear, or life, comment below. What's one thing you're postponing due to financial fear, but that you know really matters? And if this video helped you think differently, please subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this story. Because sometimes the most important change we can make doesn't cost money. It just costs courage. Thank you for watching. See you in the next video.